I'll talk a little bit about earlier cultures and much later cultures, more familiar, that is to say the Acadians. But I'll start much, much earlier. It'll be sort of a sampling. It won't be comprehensive by any means, but sort of a sampling of some sites. Some I'll touch on very briefly, and other sites I'll spend a little bit more time on. First, I should say, the very idea of archaeology of Acadiana strikes some people, perhaps, certainly not anyone in this audience, but for some people it seems odd. It seems like archaeology of where? Acadiana? What archaeology could there possibly be in Acadiana? I'll relate to you a story I sometimes tell students, and that is, this is something that really happened to me when I was in Arkansas. I ran into a woman at a little gift shop, and she asked me what I was doing. I told her I was a student of archaeology. She asked me what I was studying. I said archaeology, and she started talking about pyramids and dinosaurs, and clearly she didn't know what I was interested in. So I said, well, the archaeology of the southeastern United States. And she looked at me like I was, I'd said something incomprehensible and said, well, it must be hard to study archaeology in a country that's only 200 years old. She actually said that. And I looked at her, my mouth sort of dropping, and I said, well, there were people here before then. And then she kind of went, oh, yeah, and then it was clicking in. And I like to think that she was a rare exception. But sometimes I think, that there's a lot missing from our history. There's a lot missing from our knowledge of history, knowledge of American history, as well as our knowledge of Louisiana history. The archaeology of Acadiana. It comes as a surprise to some people to learn, for example, that people were living in Acadiana, as it's defined as a region. Of course, it's the name itself, and as we define it, is relatively recent, only a few decades. But in that region, people have been living there for at least 12,000 years. And this is just a cursory outline of the time periods that archaeologists have put together, a chronology of the different time periods. Paleo-Indian, the first peoples of the North America, dating to about 10,000 BC, and now likely earlier. There are some earlier sites. Archaic. Louisiana, it comes as a surprise to some people, was really the New York City of the Archaic period. That is to say, Louisiana was where it was happening. The lower Mississippi Valley and sites in Louisiana, we're now finding out that there were things going on which were unprecedented in North and South America. That is to say, monument building, mound building, 4,000 BC, 3,500 to 4,000 BC, building of mounds during the Archaic period. The woodland, people making ceramics, also building mounds. You think of Indian mounds, and I'm going to talk about some Indian mounds and show you some slides from some Indian mound sites. Mississippi period as well, and then the historic period, which I've placed at about AD 1700 onto the present. All of these dates are just rough approximations. Really, archaeology is about the study of any undocumented past, both prehistoric and historic. Archaeology is about people. That is to say, it's about our stories about people in the past. Certainly, archaeology is about things. Archaeology is about artifacts. It's about the objects. That's how archaeology started. Archaeology started in what we would call, I guess, antiquarianism, collecting stuff to stick it in museums. If that's all we did, then we wouldn't call it archaeology today. That is to say, archaeology is about interpreting people's lives in the past, really their histories, their cultures, their economies, how they organized themselves economically and politically, what they ate, where they lived, and when they lived there. These are really basic questions, which surprisingly we often know very little. That is to say, those two last questions, where people lived in the past and when they lived there. I showed you that chronology stretching back to 10,000 BC. There is evidence that Native Americans were living along the Vermilion River that early. Exactly where they're living, where the groups are living, and where they're moving, and what they're doing, we only have the sketchiest of pictures. So archaeology is about people. It's about Native Americans. Certainly the sovereign tribes that exist today, but also the prehistoric tribes, or the groups that were living in the state prehistoric, before any written documentation. I got to thinking about archaeological sites in Louisiana, specifically in Acadiana. What do we know about sites in Acadiana? Okay? What do we know about the sites that are recorded? One of the functions of the Louisiana Division of Archaeology is to record sites. And this makes sense when you think about it. If someone finds an arrowhead, or someone finds a projectile point, or a particular artifact, or an entire site, that is to say a trove of artifacts or burials or something, if it's recorded, then certainly, if the site's 1,000 years old, which would be relatively recent from my perspective, or if it's much, much older, we should know about it for the future. That is to say, the person who finds it may want to make record of that once they've passed on. They may want other people to know about it. It doesn't protect it. It doesn't stop it from being damaged if it's on private land. It gives it no level of protection, certainly. It's just recording the site, saying, hey, this is here, this might be important, it might be a source of information. So that's what the Louisiana Division of Archaeology does. I got some information from the Division of Archaeology for sites in Acadiana, those that are recorded. It certainly covers a large area. We might argue about whether a few of these parishes could be excluded or a few need to be added. But just looking at these 22 parishes in this area, Lafayette has the most recorded numbers of sites per, and I had to go to 10 square, that's miles, 10 square miles. Nearly 5 sites per 10 square miles, okay? At first I did a square mile, and there were hardly any. There were less than 1 per square mile, so I had to go to, 10 square miles. So you think that's within our grasp, right? How large of an area that is, 10 square miles. Okay, less than 5 for Lafayette, but on average about 2. On average about 2 sites per 10 square miles for all of the Acadian parishes. Some of the lower ones are 0.9, so just under 1, or about 1 site per 10 square miles for like Acadia Parish, Jefferson Davis, Vermilion Parish, which is a very big parish. Now, this doesn't represent the sites that are out there, and by sites I mean places of habitation or places that bear some evidence of past human presence, past human artifacts, artifact production, whether it's someone camped there overnight or passed through an area or a community lived there for 100 years or 1,000 years. It includes all that, both historic and prehistoric. Well, let me tell you, this is very, very few sites. How many sites could be recorded in a parish? Well, a lot if you began looking. Now, here's something interesting. Vernon Parish, that's not in Acadiana, is it? But it's adjacent, right? It's real close. Vernon Parish. This always amazed me. When I looked at all the site records, I would pile all the site records up, and it always amazed me how tall the binders were for Vernon Parish. Okay? Over 3,604 sites as of relatively recently. In one parish, which ends up being 20% of all recorded sites in Louisiana. 20% of all recorded sites in Louisiana are in Vernon Parish, okay? And you all know where that is, sort of in the west central Louisiana. Whereas in all of the 22 Acadiana parishes, we get, 2,877. Seems like a lot, but that's an enormous area. That is approximately 33% of the land area in the state, okay? So what does this mean? Well, it means that this is a function of looking for sites and recording them. A place in North America, a mound site dating to that age. But again, there's no protection for it. We have to go beyond that education and interest. Well, we have to go beyond interest and get some education. And I'll just mention this and then move on. And that is, it's fine to collect artifacts, and it's fine to become interested in archaeology, but if you are not doing certain things, that is to say, if it's just about the things, if it's just about the collecting of artifacts, then it really is not archaeology. It's sort of an earlier forerunner of archaeology. It's antiquarianism. It's collecting artifacts. That's all it is. I even use the term sometimes fetishizing objects, of saying, look at this artifact, isn't it great? And if you haven't recorded where it came from, then when you pass on or you pass the artifact on to someone else, no one else will. So it's a link to the past, and it's that incredibly important link to the past that allows us to tell something about the people who made and used it that's important for archaeology. That is to say, again, the story and the history of the people in the past. Some of the words that archaeologists use: recording, obviously, recording the site with the Louisiana Division of Archaeology, saying it's there. Who knows? 50 years from now, they may want to put up an airport or a bridge. And then someone will say, hey, but look, there's a cemetery there. There's an ancient cemetery or a early historic cemetery there. Maybe we should give it a look before we put it in the airport or bridge. Provenience, context, research design. These terms basically refer to knowing where things are coming from and relating them to the landscape in order to say something about the people. That's my summary of those of archaeological techniques, the people, getting to the people and saying something. This is actually a site which I recorded, and I show some artifacts here, and this is in Acadia Parish, and I was surprised to find out that there were only 54 sites at the time in Acadia Parish, and the site was extensively potted, what we would call potted, or holes dug everywhere, and some of them had been refilled. Many of them had been refilled and moved on. I named the site Sabrina's Sandbox, in sort of a jest, kind of, I didn't mean it to be mean or anything, but that is to say that I found a pail, a sandbox pail with a girl's name written on it, Sabrina. And from the looks of it, there massive amounts of excavation had gone over here, and I estimated at least a decade, maybe 2 decades, 20 years of excavations going on at this site, which dates from about 1000 BC and later, a early woodland and late archaic site. And one of the collectors that showed me this site had shown me some of these artifacts, potentially very interesting site that we might be able to tell something about the people that lived there. However, as of yet, we don't know much at all, other than they were just there. Moving on, for some other bigger sites, Berwick Mounds, down around Morgan City. This is a place that always fascinated me. The Chitimacha capital, not according to James Cathcart, but this is a quote from Cathcart's journal, where he talks about the 4 Indian mounds at the time at Berwick or near Morgan City, which he says were veiled, the origin of which is veiled by the lapse of time. He describes them situated at right angles. He elsewhere describes them as flat-topped platform mounds. He says the largest of which was about 30 feet high. He dismisses that they were associated with the Chitimacha, although he recognizes that was the most likely connection. In fact, we would say, based on what little we know about this site, that likely it was an ancestral Chitimacha site, an ancestral Chitimacha mound site, based on his description of the mounds. However, then he says perhaps it was perhaps they were the work of the Attakapaw. Not likely, but seems like a more likely connection with the Chitimacha. And then, of course, he offers his opinion on the Attakapaw, detestable tribe who are reportedly extinct. I put that because it really reflects an attitude that certainly is not present today among most people, but what really represents the history of where we've come from. That is to say, how can we be so careless? How can we be so thoughtless about the destruction of an ancient heritage? That is to say, home sites and monuments of antiquity that represent Native American heritage. Well, I think it's quite easy to do it, because all we have to do is alienate ourselves from it and say, well, it's not ours, it's not mine, it's someone else's. The minute we say, well, that's part of Louisiana history, that's part of Louisiana's heritage, then we make a connection to it. We might imagine what Berwick Mounds might have looked like today. There are other mound sites like this. There's Troyville, the enormous mound site of Troyville in present-day Jonesville, which I often talk about. But Berwick Mounds might have had a mound that looked something like this. It may have been a Coles Creek, what we call a Coles Creek or Mississippian mound site. There may have been a chief residing on one of the mounds. Do we know that from the description? Well, I've been to the site. I've walked around and looked at it. And we don't know that. That is to say, we don't know anything about the site other than Cathcart's description, because this is where the site is located. And it's a bit of irony, and I really appreciate irony, that this is located on Mound Street. There are no mounds there. There are just streets, and it's a block, and there's, this is a bit of a dated picture. I don't know if Halliburton has moved on, but there's a mobile home park. And you might think, wow, what a great opportunity was missed. What awesome opportunity was missed. And you could then come at it from various angles, to learn about the past, to learn about this site, to learn about the Chitimacha's ancestry, to learn about Louisiana history. How about from an economic angle? To profit from cultural tourism, to have people come here, to have people come from the surrounding, I was going to say state, but really from afar, even internationally, to come see a prehistoric mound site with perhaps a museum. There are precedents. There are sites like that, Moundville in Alabama, Marksville in Louisiana. Well, that opportunity was missed, unfortunately. There are many other sites, and really close next to Berwick Mounds is another mound site, Fairview Plantation Mounds, which unfortunately was destroyed more recently. And that's also my best approximation of what the site, what direction you'd be looking at to see the mounds. Of course, it's a neighborhood now, and it was under construction when we were there. A little bit closer to home, that is to say, very close to where we are today, right? The airport, Lafayette Airport mounds, Indian mounds. I said I appreciate irony. Well, here's a little more irony. It's my belief, or I've come to believe, that people come to want to have an attachment to the past. People meaning community, groups of people. They want to have an attachment to the past, and they want to make that attachment in the landscape. They want to look around and say, hey, we're kind of special. We're a special place. We're unique. We're Acadiana. We have a history. We're not just a generic community. We're unusual. Someone comes to your town, you want to show them some places. You want to go show them a museum, or you want to show them something interesting about your community. Maybe they'll never return again. Maybe they want to go for a boat ride. Maybe you're hoping that the Vermilion is clean, right? Really clean that day, and that you don't run into any scenes. That happened to me, actually, after I moved home. You want maybe to take them to a mound site, Lafayette Airport Indian Mounds, and show them the Indian mounds there. Well, let's see, I actually brought a pointer so I could make this pretty clear. That is to say, as a young kid, I used to go here because I was told there were Indian mounds at the airport. So I always went down here and I always said, aha, here's the Indian mound, right here. In fact, if you go by the airport today in a boat, you see something that looks like how does my 6-year-old daughter say it? Hunormous? A hunormous mound? It's big. It's a big mound-shaped sort of thing. Is it an Indian mound? I can't say with certainty, but I don't think it is. I think it's just a natural landform. I think it's a natural landform that is part of the edge of the Pleistocene terrace. That is to say, this is at the exact spot where the Vermilion River cuts through the terrace, right, into the floodplain. And if you look at it closely in this contour map, it shows a channel cut through on the other side. That is to say, this mound was created, this natural contour was created by that crevasse, or by that channel cut through, by this channel. And there are others like this along the prairie escarpment, or along the terrace edge. In fact, if you look at the maps, you can find some that look just like this. It's not that unusual. Well, that's kind of disappointing. That's kind of a downer. People don't want to hear that. People want to hear about the great Indian mounds that we have in Lafayette. Well, we have to rule that one out. I'm sorry. Not completely, again. We could go look at it, and as someone pointed out to me recently, there could be a site there. As far as we know now, there are no recorded sites there. That is to say, not recorded with the Louisiana Division of Archaeology. Now, what about the Lafayette Airport Indian mounds? What about the Indian mounds? Weren't there Indian mounds there? Well, a little bit more of the irony. Yes, there were, but they've all been destroyed. That is to say, there were at least two sites with mounds at the airport or in the vicinity of the airport, and these question marks are not in precisely the correct place, not all of them, but this represents the numbers of sites recorded that have been destroyed at the airport or buried underneath the airport that could be potentially looked at. There are other mounds. In fact, there's a mound right off of Pinhook on one of the side streets going to the Vermilion River that used to be there. That's in a neighborhood that is gone. And you begin to think, isn't that sad? That is to say, the growth of Lafayette required the destruction of Indian mounds, and then we mythologize the past and say, look at this is our Indian mound. That's kind of a downer, isn't it? Well, I think it's important to think about and to realize and to say, why did that happen? Shouldn't we care about it? Because I think it's a lesson that we can learn for the future and that we can carry with us and say, well, shouldn't we care about the places that we still have, places that are still with us, before we have to say, site destroyed by extension of runway at Lafayette Airport, could have been of certain age, we don't know now, it's gone. Sad story, huh? How should we deal with cultural resources in the way of progress? I was talking to someone recently about how progress is often, elevated as if it were purely economic. That progress is something that's going to happen, it's inevitable, we need it to happen. We all like progress, right? It sounds great, it's economic, but we often pit it against cultural resources, or we often pit it against heritage, which from my perspective makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. It seems strange to think about it in those terms. It's really unnatural when we think about it, because it dehumanizes us and makes us say, well, sure, progress is purely economic. In societies that are non-cultural or that don't have any heritage, it doesn't make any sense. Well, here's an example of something that might work out better, not in Acadiana, but another airport, and that is to say, this is some recent news, and there's a more recent news article. This is a news flash. Did you like how the paper flew in? News flash. Macon County in North Carolina, Franklin, North Carolina, is building an airport extension that, in fact, will destroy a Cherokee village site, which is historically documented, and I don't recall the name of the historic name of the village, but was, I believe, 16th, 17th century occupied, back 2,000 years, back to about 1 AD. So a village site of great antiquity with remains of houses, remains, artifacts, including burials, cemetery there. The state got together, the state archaeologists got together with the airport authority to develop it, looked at it and said, well, we should sample this site. That is to say, we should do a little archaeology and do a larger sample than usual, a 25% sample. Usually archaeologists that are interested in looking at a site will only sample, say, 5%, or even less, if they're just interested in learning about the site, getting a little information about the site. In this case, you're talking about the destruction of a site, right, or total burial of a site, burial of burials, destruction of a cemetery. Well, the Cherokee tribe, Eastern Band, disagreed and said, no, we should have 100% recovery of anything that's going to be destroyed. This is our heritage, and North Carolina should appreciate that, and they should deal with it. I read a more recent article, this is April 9, I read a more recent news article from June where apparently they were at an impasse, but there was a memorandum of agreement written up that said that the entire area, about 5.25 acres, would be stripped and mapped, and that burials would be removed, studied, and that the remains would be reinterred afterwards. This is about heritage, and it's about preserving the past and learning about the past. So how should we deal with cultural resources in the way of progress? Again, that mistaken notion that progress is purely economic and that it is opposed to culture and history. We have to really decide, what do we value? Do we just value buying and selling? Do we just value a good home, built well, built sturdily? whether or not it's built on top of graves of people? Or do we want to know something about the past? If so, we could say economic resources are cultural. Economic resources are cultural resources, and cultural resources are economic. There's a relationship there. We might think of it in terms of cultural tourism. We could think about it in other ways as well. That is to say, we should value things that we normally value and develop it as part of progress, that we should make what we value as part of progress. And that we shouldn't use ignorance as an excuse. We shouldn't use ignorance and the ultimate apathy that leads from it as an excuse. They are not progress. We have good examples of this in Louisiana. I don't want to be too harsh. We have excellent examples. Poverty Point State Historic Site. These other historic sites, state historic sites, if you can make some of these out. In Louisiana, Marksville State Historic Site. There are over 700 recorded mound sites in Louisiana. 2 of them are state historic sites. Most of them are privately owned. Most of these mound sites, Indian mound sites, are privately owned. There is something called the Ancient Mounds Heritage Trail in northeast Louisiana. And this is an excellent way that the state has worked with private landowners to develop an interest in archaeology and an interest in conserving prehistoric mound sites. That is to say, making a trail where people can actually drive, and I brought some of the brochures, and I think Jennifer put them back there, where you can actually drive around and look at mound sites on the landscape, and there are little short summaries in the driving trail pamphlet about what we know about these different mound sites. So we can get a little education and a little interest in the past. Well, now I want to say something about the past. Now I want to actually say something about the people in the past and the sites that they've lived at. There's what's called the Mayfield Clovis Point site. It's a small site, that is to say, what most archaeologists would call an isolated find, which means there is one artifact of a Clovis point. A Clovis point. So 10,000 BC or perhaps earlier, people were living on the banks of the Vermilion River. Comes as a surprise to some people to learn about that. It is not uncommon that a Clovis point is found by itself and that it is an isolated find. In fact, many Clovis points are found as isolated finds, and it's explained that these people are moving vast distances. Frequently, the material, and I think the material from this site or the next site, is actually made out of a chert from central Texas. These people are moving vast distances. We don't think that they were trading with other people to get the material there. And they're highly mobile. However, some early sites, some Paleo-Indian sites, there's more than certainly an isolated find, and it's certainly within the realm of imagination to think that people were camping and living for extended periods of time along the Vermilion River and coming back there. That is to say, going out and hunting and coming back to a campsite that might still be there and might not yet be destroyed along the Vermilion River. Makes you wonder. That site has not been recorded. Such a site has not been recorded yet or looked at. There's the site Cote Blanche Island, which is also is an isolated find. Another Clovis Point. And Cote Blanche Island, as many of you probably know, is one of the salt domes in South Louisiana in St. Mary Parish. There's Salt Mine Valley, which many people point to as evidence of Paleo-Indian presence, or very ancient presence in South Louisiana. Unfortunately, we don't know too much about it, other than there were in fact megafaunal remains, or remains of extinct Pleistocene age mammals. There's actually mastodon remains, and also what I really like is a giant sloth right there at Avery Island, mixed in with other materials, including some later tools. It's unclear, and most archaeologists think that it's an unclear association, or I'll use that term that I introduced earlier, context. That is to say, were the tools associated with the Paleo-Indian or with the Pleistocene faunal remains? Most archaeologists don't think it's conclusive. More work needs to be done. That work was done in the 1960s by Woody Gagliano. But certainly there are sites of that age in Acadiana. More recent, Well, you could, in one sense, you could say that there's another older site along the Vermilion, the Trappy Mastodon site, which, by its name, you can tell, had mastodon remains at it. And as you might also tell, it was located where the Trappy plant was. That is to say, right along the Vermilion River. However, I included in archaic period sites here because the artifacts that were found with it were not in direct association. That is to say, the context was one in which the points, the projectile points, were much later. We would say that the mastodon was certainly Pleistocene age or last ice age, very ancient. The projectile points were something we call a Marcos point, which is archaic, which is more recent. It's not to say that there aren't earlier artifacts there. It could be looked at. Banana Bayou Mound, or Bona Bayou Mound, as some of the family wanted to be called, also at Avery Island, also on the southeast tip of Avery Island. This is an archaic mound site. Banana Bayou Mound is an archaic mound site which really got a lot of attention very early on. That is to say, when it was looked at by Gagliano, he got some very, very early dates from it, 3900 BC to about 2500 BC. And this is early on in archaeology for such an early mound site. That is to say, hunter-gatherers, people living at that time, fishing, certainly doing a lot of fishing, but also hunting, deer, small mammal. And here they are building a mound, building an Indian mound. Well, that's a monument. That's a monument to a group, or it's a monument to a tribe, to their identity, maybe marking a territory. Well, why didn't archaeologists like that? Well, decades ago, it was believed that no mounds dated that early. So it was kind of ignored. It was in the literature, people sort of ignored it. Well, by the 1990s, we started getting these other sites, like LSU mounds in East Baton Rouge Parish, but also other sites throughout Louisiana, up and down the Mississippi Valley, that date this to this age, 3500 BC, 4000 BC. Mound sites, some of them quite large, some of them immense. To give some perspective, some of these sites that we're talking about, this is 1,000 years before the construction of the Great Pyramids. 1,000 years before the construction of the Great Pyramids, Indians are building mounds, large mounds, and we don't understand entirely what they were used for. We don't think that they were used as burial mounds. Those come much, much later, thousands of years later. But nonetheless, they are building these mounds on the landscape, and they're spending a good amount of time and labor doing it. To get the labor to do this would require a lot of food to feed people. How is this even possible? Well, we're learning about Native American society's economy and their political organization, and we basically think that people are able to do it because Louisiana was so rich a place. Sportsman's paradise, right? That is to say, one theory put forward by archaeologist Joe Saunders is that there were certain places on the landscape were just absolutely so rich in wildlife that they'd be crazy to pass through and not stay. That is to say, they didn't need to wander widely. I use that term wander. They didn't need to make subsistence rounds. They could, in fact, stay fairly sedentary. So now we have something which fairly recently seemed didn't make any sense, and that is sedentary foragers or sedentary hunter-gatherers, people staying in the same place, hunting and gathering, enjoying the incredibly bountiful resources, and calling a place home. 4000 BC, so 6,000 years ago. Stele Mounds, which is located in St. Landry Parish, which is another early archaic period site which has some very early dates from it that archaeologist Michael Rousseau worked at. So there are a number of these early sites. I'm going to move on, because I think I'm taking up a lot more time than I had planned, to woodland period. So I'm basically taking you through sort of these periods I'd mentioned, and I just picked two or three really sites from different periods to give you sort of a sample. Woodland period is incredibly important to archaeologists in that this is the advent of pottery making. That is to say, it's during this period that Native Americans start producing and using pottery. And this is incredibly important because it does relate to more settled lifestyle, staying in place more, but it also relates to different use of the environment and a different technology associated with that use. It also is associated with the ability of archaeologists to use this pottery to tell time. That is to say, chronology. So for the first time, we have pottery with different decorations on it, which can be used to build chronologies, to build a timeline by looking at the different styles of pottery, and to look at different cultures, and to name these different cultures according to the pottery. For example, Tchefuncte culture. Well, one of the most important Tchefuncte culture sites is Lafayette Mounds. In fact, a mound site not too far from the airport, which, as far as I know, is still in existence, which is north on the Vermilion, which was visited by archaeologists Jem Ford and Quimby, who went there and published a short monograph or a short book on it, which included other sites in 1945, which really set the stage for knowing more about Tchefuncte culture. There's the Marksville site in Avoyelles Parish, which really is the center of Marksville culture, if not the major, it is the major Marksville culture site. If any of you have not been there, I encourage you to go. It's a major Marksville site that dates from about AD 1 to 400. Actually, some of the site dates a bit earlier. Those are the dates for Marksville culture, AD 1 to about 400. There is a burial mound there. That's Mound 4. Mound 4 shown here. But there are also other large platform mounds. It is up on the terrace overlooking the floodplain right there in Marksville. It's really an incredible place when you think about it. And these are burial mounds, or at least this conical mound here is a burial mound. The WPA worked there in the 1930s. And we know a lot about Marksville today from their work and from subsequent archaeology that's been done there. This pot here is from Marksville, or as a Marksville culture pot. Also, one final site that really spans the woodland period, Morton Shell Mound in Iberia Parish, down along the coast on Weeks Island. It's actually a mound comprised of shell, that is to say, the discarded shell from meals that has been piled up over many, many centuries. That is to say, it's Tchefuncte, Marksville, Coles Creek, what we would call a multi-component site, meaning people went there and continued going back there. And we're talking about more than a few generations. We're talking about basically from about 800 BC to about 700 AD. That would span those cultures right there, if not longer, actually into the Plaquemine period after that. And these are some of the sherds that I had mentioned down here on the right, that with the different decorations that lets us tell time, that lets us say, well, this is a Marksville culture site, or the people here were somehow associated with Marksville, or this is a Coles Creek site. We can do this through looking at the different decorated ceramics, looking at the different designs. These are all different types. These, for example, right here are what we call mosaic incised, which are Coles Creek and early Plaquemine sherds. Jennifer had shown you a book earlier that came out, Plaquemine Archaeology is the title, of which I have a chapter and co-authored an introduction, in which we look at this culture called Plaquemine, named after not the parish, but the city, Plaquemine, Louisiana, named after the city, actually named after the city because of the mound site, the Medora mound site, which was near it, which was quite close by, which was excavated in the 1940s, in which archaeologists identified a distinctive, several distinctive types of pottery, which they used to tell time, the decoration on the pottery, and said, well, this is a little bit different than the earlier pottery. And it's a little bit different than this later Natchez pottery. So let's call it Plaquemine, literally. Let's call it Plaquemine. Let's call this pottery Plaquemine culture pottery. Sometimes they use the Plaquemine period. We'd say it dates to the Mississippi period. Well, the pottery associated with that culture is found from about the south of the confluence of the Arkansas and Mississippi rivers, southward all the way to the coast, and eastward from Mississippi westward into the Chenier Plain. That is to say, it's sort of a lower Mississippi Valley thing. These are not all the mound sites or all the Plaquemine mound sites in this area. These are just some of the mound sites, some of the major mound sites in the western Atchafalaya Basin that I visited with students, at least one of which I see, a couple that I see, who visited these sites, and we did some field schools at. That is to say, we collected really basic information about the people. If we were just going there to collect artifacts, then we wouldn't be much. That is to say, we wouldn't be much different than the collectors who have visited all of these sites for the past 100 years, most of which are unknown and lost for all time. What did Cathcart say? Veiled in the mist of time. People gone there, dug, found things, and left. Well, our goal was to learn something about the people there. And the most basic of questions is, when did they live there? What does the site date to? When was the mound constructed? These are really basic questions, which I have answered for some of these mound sites in a very cursory fashion, just really the first few steps. And then other questions that still need to be answered, such as, what were they eating? What were their lives like? How did they organize their communities economically, politically? All sorts of questions that we can look at. I'll look at one site, SL3, up here on Bayou Rouge, in a little bit more detail, one of the mound sites. It's a very impressive site, and it's, I think, the last site that we had a field school at, the last mound site that we had a field school at. And then I'll just very briefly show you a few slides from three others, Portage, Guidry, Portage, and Lauraville. Has anybody seen the Lauraville mound site here? You can't miss it if you drive through Lauraville. A close-up, or hopefully showing that area of Bayou Rouge, Portage Guidry, Portage, and I don't have Lauraville on there, but I'm just going to show that very briefly. Here's Medora, what I had talked about. That is to say, that is the birthplace of Plaquemine culture. That is the place where archaeologists excavating identified this pottery and said, we should make this distinctive culturally and temporally, and set it apart and give it this name, Plaquemine. Well, that's where it happened, at Medora, right near Plaquemine, the city. Bayou Rouge. This is a contour map which I made with the students, which I couldn't have made without the students, hacking through the brush, in some places pretty dense. And some of the excavations we did, and very minor excavations. We're not talking about digging enormous excavations into mounds or anything like that. We're talking about trying to find places where people were living, to get some material that we can date and find out when they were living there and when the mounds were built. So how little can we dig? That's almost the goal for a field school. How little can we actually dig and answer some of those questions? Because you don't have that much time for a field school, and the students aren't going to work too hard, right? That this is a break, right? You're supposed to be having a good time. So the answer is, these are tiny little units. They're only actually about a foot across. They're 50 centimeters. Test unit 7, I'll show you a slide. A couple of other test units, 4 and 5. And then some larger units, 1 and 2, which is actually on the top of a mound, but which actually is mostly in a gully, which was dug out in one of the mounds. This is an incredible site. It's privately owned. I can't really tell you exactly where it is. It's been potted before. That is to say, people have visited it to find artifacts, to keep for themselves, and sort of just use it as sort of a treasure trove. One reason we don't know much about this site. When we went here, we were told it could date anywhere from, we thought, 400 AD to as late as, say, 1700 AD. We didn't have a good idea of what culture it might fit in. Some of those cultures I had talked about, perhaps not Marksville, but perhaps what we call Troyville or Coles Creek or Plaquemine. It's an incredibly interesting site to me because it's so distinct and different than some of these other sites in Acadiana, in the region. Big, flat-top platform mounds. I did my dissertation, my graduate work, at a place called Moundville, and when I went here, Moundville in Alabama, when I went here, I thought, this looks like Moundville. That is to say, this big mound here, Mound D especially, it's a big, flat platform mound that had a building on it. I guarantee you. I don't know that for sure. Is that speculation? Well, I know what the mound dates to, and I've gone up there and seen how level that surface is and the size and the configuration. And knowing what it dates to is important because there were flat-top mounds. There were mounds that Indians built that were flat-topped, which were not burial mounds, which are quite early, Marksville in age, which date before 400 AD, which we don't think were used as places where buildings were placed. What do we call them? Well, some have said they're ceremonial mounds, places for dances or meetings, ceremonial mounds. But this mound, it had a house on top of it, I just know it, or a temple, a big building. Some of these other mounds are unusual. This is the largest and the highest mound. I'll show you pictures of A and D because they're in the clearing. These others were in dense woods when we visited the site. B and C are unusual in that they are stepped, as so they have a lower platform and what looks like a higher platform or a conical mound on top of it. That's the reason why some archaeologists who visited the site early on thought, well, maybe this is a Troyville site. It kind of looks like a site that dates before, say, 700 AD. We really knew absolutely nothing about this site until about 3 years ago when we went there. In fact, it wasn't even in the literature. I couldn't believe it. I mean, I went back, and as of the 1970s, this mound site was not known in the literature. Of course, it was known to local people who visited there and dug there and collected artifacts, but otherwise, it didn't exist. You know, it could have been completely obliterated, and archaeologists wouldn't have missed it because we didn't know about it. Really. Of course, it is protected, and the landowners are doing a wonderful job of keeping people off of the site, the people who live there, because they don't want it messed up. After we had mapped the site, some people came in and did a lot of clearing, but this is the large mound, this is Mound A, and you kind of get an idea. The summit is up here, and it's actually obscured by woods. This was actually covered completely like this, the entire mound. That's one of the students holding a mirror that we used to produce that map. That is to say, the digital mapping instrument. And this is the other mound, Mound D, that I had mentioned, a big flat platform mound. And it does have a gully cut into it that had been cut into its side, but otherwise it's very intact. And those are just our cars and the landowners' cars. We would drive up to it and work there. First, something about the excavations in Mound D. We actually placed it on the edge of the gully, wanting to disturb as little as possible when we excavated into the mound. We want to get a date from the mound. We want to know something about its construction, how many, what we would call episodes of construction, how fast was it built. It's a very large mound. And try to obtain some material that we can date, that we can radiocarbon date. Not surprisingly, the soil was practically free of artifacts. And looking at it a little bit closer, this excavation is about, it is 2 meters by 1 meter, or about 3 feet by 6 feet. And not surprisingly to me, there were very few artifacts, and it looks to have been built very rapidly, perhaps in 2 stages or 2 episodes of mound building where they worked and built up the mound. And this is near the bottom. In fact, this is at the base of the mound where the soil is much darker and where we think we have the subsoil a little bit further than this, but where we think we have the ground surface underneath the mound. And that's, I think, that's the end of the excavation. That would be about 2.1 meters, or about 6 feet deep, to go beneath the mound surface. So we did find some charcoal near the base that we could date, and I'll come back to that in a second. Something really fascinating that we found in all of the small excavation units, and these are these really small excavation units that are just a foot across that we excavated. Something fascinating that we found is this dark soil, which you might call a midden, which in some places really was a midden. That is to say, a soil rich with junk, with trash, with debris, with things that people threw out that they didn't need anymore, like the remains of a meal, bones, pieces of bone, but also ceramic, pottery sherds that were thrown out and placed in this dark soil. And the dark soil is covered up, you'll see, very nicely by all of this lighter colored soil, which has relatively few artifacts, few to no artifacts, which is a relatively more recent deposit, a flood deposits most likely, on top of it, sealing it off very nicely from any further destruction. So what we think we have here, if you saw that map again along the bayou, these test units were very widely spaced. What we think we have found is a village area along the bayou where people were actually living. The remains of their village is buried beneath the flood deposits, buried down in here. And subsoil is visible beneath that. Oops. Some of the ceramics that we found there. We were finding a lot of this Pontchartrain check-stamped pottery, which has this curious sort of check stamping, which is made by a paddle, which is placed on it, which some of the varieties of which date quite early, or Coles Creek. When I saw the mound, I thought, well, this mound must date after about AD 1200. If it's a big platform mound with a building on top of it, that would fit with the Mississippi period, maybe a little bit earlier. However, we're finding this much earlier ceramic, and there is a lot of this ceramic, so there was an earlier village there. However, we're also finding some later ceramics, such as the Plaquemine brushed, and these are only small pottery sherds, parts of whole vessels that have been broken up and discarded. Well, the Plaquemine brushed is, as you might imagine, the name associated with the name of the culture, Plaquemine culture. So some of these Plaquemine brushed sherds that we recovered from the site. We also did some coring. That is to say, we placed a 2-inch diameter core, which was on the back of an ATV, which we got up on top of one of the mounds and placed all the way through that large mound, which when I'd shown you, I didn't think I mentioned, it's about just over 4 meters high. Just over 4 meters high, which is a fairly large mound, or just over 12 feet. And so we placed this as a single core, although it's broken up in pieces. This is a single soil core, and this is the bottom. This is beneath the mound. This is that dark soil, which I can't say is a buried topsoil or a buried A-horizon, but it's certainly beneath the mound building. And then you have these layers of clay going up this way as you go towards the top. I might be doing that wrong, but these are going up this way. And then you have these nice little layers of burned soil just full of charcoal, which is what we like. That is to say, we tried to get one nearby and hit it again, but this is a burned surface within the mound. This is a burned surface within the mound, which we can date. So, when did they live there? One of the most basic questions that we can ask. Well, the radiocarbon dates from the Mound A core, and it works out very nicely, too, because we dated 2 of them, and that is the lower ones from about, the calibrated median is about AD 1180. Again, in radiocarbon dating, that's give or take. You have a time span, but it's always better to have more than one radiocarbon date. A radiocarbon date of 1180, and then another one above that of 1260, AD 1260. Hey, we're right there. This is a Mississippian mound site. This is a Mississippian mound site with Coles Creek and Plaquemine ceramics, Mississippi period, I should say. Some of the other dates from TU, it doesn't do any good, TU1, which is in Mound D, go along with that quite nicely. This is the large excavation unit that we put in that big platform mound, and that's near the bottom, I believe. Yeah, level 19 and level 20. That is material from near the bottom of the mound, AD 1230 and AD 1270. Now, the dates from the surfaces, those surfaces that I told you about, the midden, are a little bit earlier, from TU4 and TU7, but still, we're talking about a time span or a period of which there's activity and people are living here along the bayou and they're building these mounds. And I would say that time span is right around 1000 AD to probably 1300 AD. So you have time period, and probably the time period in which the mounds were built was much briefer within there, a segment of time within that larger time span. I would say that this is generations of people that are living there, and we don't know as much about the site. The reason I'm pausing is I don't want to get myself in trouble by speculating too much, but based on what we know, yeah, one group of people from about AD 1000 to 1300 lived there and built the mounds. But again, we dug, overall, we dug maybe 4 square meters, which is a very small excavation for an immense site. So there could be there could be things at this site that we don't know about. There could even be other mounds. I mean, they were sedentary. I mean, they were living there, and we don't know much about what they were eating. They were certainly hunting and fishing and doing a lot of fishing, but we didn't look too much at subsistence. The big question is, were they agriculturalists? Were they growing maize? And I can't say whether or not they were. It was certainly known, and across the Mississippi River, people certainly were planting maize. So there's all sorts of questions we could begin to ask now. How are we going to answer them? I like to think that the pottery changes because of the people. That is to say, and likely, in many instances, the women who teach, who hand down pottery traditions. Just a couple of slides from the mound site Portage Guidry, which we visited early on, I believe 2001, and then went back to in 2003, excavated that, mapped. Incredibly to me, I mean, it's a very large mound site near Henderson. Incredibly to me, there was no good map of this site. No one had mapped it. It was known about. Archaeologists knew about it. It had been recorded. But no one had really even, spent that much time at it. John Gibson had brought some students there and done a little bit of work. We've only really begun to understand what is Portage Guidry, this mound site near Henderson. Through our work there, we were able to stabilize one of the mounds, which was being destroyed by an ATV. We were also able to get the Archaeological Conservancy interested in it, a national group that purchases mound sites in order to protect them. It was recognized that this mound site would slowly be destroyed. Portage Guidry, like I'd said, the Archaeological Conservancy, a national group, got interested in it, and wonderfully, the landowners, Jeannie Kramer, who had been at UL, was at UL, and her family, worked out a sale to the Archaeological Conservancy of the mound site for its preservation. When we excavated there were some radiocarbon dates that suggested it was later. We actually got, in our excavations near the mound, a lot of thick midden, just rich with animal bone, a lot of fish, a lot of deer, charcoal, and remains of fires. And this isn't from an earlier excavation, from our first excavation, but we went back and relocated this feature, or this hearth, which you can see right in here, which is above the midden. That is to say, above the level which represents the debris from the village when they built the mound. I'll say that again. This dark soil represents the debris of occupation from when they built the mounds at Portage Guidry, right here. I'm pretty confident of it, based on the radiocarbon dates and based on what we know about the mound. Well, there was a small hearth or a small campfire built on top of that. So it should date later. It's on top of it. Well, we radiocarbon dated it, and it dates to about 1350 AD. That is to say, the one higher up, about 1350 AD. So it is actually a Mississippi period site. So archaeology includes 12,000 years ago, 10,000 BC, to the more recent historic period.